students. Okay, so I'm about to go over lesson number 2. Once again, my advice to you is to have your reading guide open. So as you come across the answer, you can pause the video, type it in. I would tell you to review the questions first. So as you're listening to the video, it will help you register, oh, this is the answer to this question. You can pause and then you can type. All right. So lesson 2 is the ideas of the Enlightenment. I'm going to start with why it matters. It matters because Enlightenment thinkers or philosophers applied the scientific method to society and people. Remember, the scientific method was created by Francis Bacon. You should have read that. We did discuss that in lesson 1, but you should have read that when you went back to do your graphic organizer. They re-examined all aspects of life, from government and justice to religion and women's roles. They created a movement that influenced the entire Western world. So now let's talk about the ideas of philosophies. The question is, what role did philosophies play in the Enlightenment? How did belief in logic and reason promote the beginnings of social science? So one of the favorite words of intellectuals was reason. And in my Nearpod presentation, I showed a book with a light bulb. It said reason in science. And so they believe that people who are able to reason tended to gear their lives towards science. And so as I lecture a little bit more, you'll be able to tie those two together, right? So the ideas of two 17th century Englishmen, John Locke and Sir Isaac Newton, especially influenced enlightened intellectuals, right? In his essay concerning human understanding, Locke argued that every person was born with a tabula rasa, or a blank mind. And he believed at a young age, when you're born into the world, you really don't have any understanding. But as you continue to navigate the world and you learn different things, your mind no longer is a blank slate. It is filled with those experiences and all that intellect that you gain. So now, Locke's ideas suggested that people were formed by the experiences that came through their senses from the surrounding world. So both Sir Isaac Newton's thinking and John Locke's thinking are very much interwoven, right? So one believed that you were born with a blank mind, which is very true. And then John Locke added to that with the idea that you are able to fill your mind based on the experiences that you get from the world that you're in. So now the ideas of Sir Isaac Newton also influenced 18th century intellectuals. Newton believed that the physical world and everything in it was like a giant machine. His world machine operated according to natural laws. And remember, Sir Isaac Newton had 3 of them. And so the Enlightenment thinkers saw that Newton was able to discover the natural laws that govern the physical world. They reasoned they could use the scientific method, once again created by Francis Bacon, to discover the natural laws that governed human society. So now we're going into the role of philosophy. So the intellectuals of the Enlightenment were known by the French word philosophy, meaning philosopher. Few of the philosophies were actual philosophers in the real meaning of the word. Instead, they were writers, professors, journalists, economists, and above all, social reformers. And we're going to be talking more about people who reformed society through their philosophies. They wanted to change society for the better. The English had provided the philosophical start for the movement, but most leaders of the Enlightenment were French. So the French philosophies influenced intellectuals elsewhere and created a movement that infected the entire Western world. So now the role of philosophy was to change the world, and it still to this day does change the world. The use of reason and the spirit of rational criticism or questioning were used for everything in society, including religion and politics. So 3 French thinkers were especially important. We have Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Diderot. And we're going to talk about all 3 of those today. So now Montesquieu, or Charles Louis de Saint-Comte, the Baron of Montesquieu, was a French noble. His famous work, The Spirit of the Law, in 1748, was a study of governments. Montesquieu tried to find the natural laws that govern the social and political relationships of human beings. Now, Montesquieu stated that the English governments had 3 branches or parts. The branches were the executive, the monarch, the legislative, the parliament, and the judicial, the court of law. Now, the government functioned through a separation of powers. The 3 branches limit and control each other in a system of checks and balances. This system stops any part from governing too much are keeping too much power. And so that's very similar to what we have in a democracy. So when we think about Montesquieu's ideology when it came to government, it's very much like what we do now with our checks and balances system with our three, right? The executive, judicial, and the legislative. So now we have Voltaire. So the greatest figure of the Enlightenment was Francois-Marie Arouet, or Voltaire. Voltaire was well known for his criticism on Christianity. He often challenged the actions of the church, one of the most powerful institutions of the time. He had a strong belief in religious toleration, and he fought religious intolerance in France. Now, Voltaire supported deism, or deism. Deism is a religious philosophy that was based on reason and natural law. To Voltaire and other philosophies, the universe was like a clock. God, the clockmaker, created the universe, set it in motion, and then allowed it to run without interference. The universe can run according to the natural laws that many people accredit to Sir Isaac Newton. So now we have Diderot. And Diderot became a writer who wrote about many different subjects. Diderot's most famous contribution to the Enlightenment was the Encyclopedia, or classified dictionary of the science, arts, and trades. It was published between 1751 and 1772. Now, Diderot wanted the encyclopedia to change how people thought, okay? And the encyclopedia became a weapon against the old French society. Many of his articles attacked religious superstition and supported religious toleration. Other artists called for social, legal, and political changes, right? And it spread Enlightenment ideas. So it was like the first collection of thoughts that made you question all these infrastructures that were there before we started to be enlightened and started looking at how humans and social structures interacted and interwove with one another. So now, new social sciences. Now, the philosophies believed that Sir Isaac's methods could be used to discover the natural laws that govern all areas of human life. Now, this led to what we call the social sciences. And history is a social science, right? We study the relationship between governments, the relationship between cultures and different people. And so the social sciences are areas of study such as economic and political science. Not only do we study culture in social science or history, we also study economics, right? How money is exchanged between whether it be individuals or different countries or provinces, or the political structures that affect one another. So the Socrates and the Scottish philosopher Adam Smith have been viewed as the founders of the modern social science of economics. They were interested in finding the natural economic laws that control human society. They thought that all society would benefit if people were free to follow their own economic self-interest. This meant that the state should not stop natural economic forces by making laws to regulate the economy. And so this was the first, in my opinion, the first thought of capitalism, right? And in a capitalist society like the one we have now, the government does have some level of like regulation, right? But they don't really control how you make your money and how you make, run your business per se. So this belief became known by its French name as laissez-faire, or this means to let people do what they want. And so Adam Smith in 1776, in his famous work, The Wealth of Nations, Smith believed in a free enterprise system. This meant that the government should not interfere or be involved in economic matters. Now, the first thing the government should do is the government should protect citizens from enemies of the state, the function of the army, right? Secondly, the government should defend citizens from injustice, the function of the police. And finally, it should keep up certain public works that private individuals could not afford, right? So for example, Social Security is one. Medicare is another one, right? Food stamps is another. So all these institutions were thought up many moons ago before they were actually implemented in a variety of different nation states. So now, let's talk about this idea of a social contract, and what does that even mean? So the most famous philosophy of the later Enlightenment was from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In his discourse on the origins of the inequality of mankind, he argued that people had started laws and government to preserve their private property. So it wasn't created as a way to govern the bodies, but to protect them. In his major work, The Social Contract, which was published in 1762, Rousseau presented the idea of the social contract. Through a social contract, an entire society agrees to be governed by the general will. This means that liberty or freedom is reached by being forced to follow the general will. So this is because the general will represents what is best for the entire community and not just for individuals, right? So Rousseau thought that people needed to be forced to be free because during this time frame, people have been so governed by their monarchy that they just didn't know any other way to be. So Rousseau was like, no, we're going to have to force you to be free because all people should be free in order to live amongst themselves. But also there's this social contract that states that we are going to live amongst each other in a certain way. Many other Enlightenment thinkers did not agree with these ideas. So a lot of them are like, nah, I think people need to be governed and controlled because if you let people do their own thing, they might not make the right choice. So women's rights. Now, you can't talk about the Enlightenment if you don't talk about women's rights because women were also a part of this movement, even though they don't get a lot of credit. But there is one that does. So for centuries, male intellectuals had argued that women were inferior to men. They believed male domination of women was necessary. By the 18th century, though, women thinkers began to express their ideas about improving the conditions of women. This woman named Mary Wollstonecraft was an English writer. She made the strongest statement for the rights of women. She's the founder of the modern European and American movements for women's rights. So in her writing A Vindication of the Rights of Women, Wollstonecraft mentioned two problems with the ideas of Enlightenment thinkers. Number one, these same people who argued that women should obey men also said it was wrong for monarchs to have arbitrary power over their subjects. So you're saying that the monarchy shouldn't control people, but men can control women. Contradiction number one. Contradiction number two was Enlightenment was based on an idea of reason in all human beings. But they were saying women weren't rational, right? They were considering women to not be rational like men, which is a contradiction because women should have the same right as men. So are we rational or are we not, right? So Wollstonecraft declared that women should have equal rights in education and also in economic and political rights. And during this time, that was really risque, right? Women were seen as self-servant. Their job was to be at the home. They were bearers of children. They were definitely not equal to men when it came to logical or emotional standing. And they definitely didn't want them to have any economic privileges because then women would run amok, right, in their mindset and there would be no children. Okay, now, that led to the next course in this whole idea of enlightenment, and it was reading. So during this time frame, only intellects were really reading, right? The people with money, the people they tended to believe were smart, they had the capacity to read. And the rest of the laborers, they didn't find reading to be a necessity because their job was to be the labor for everyone else, right? Be the labor for the bourgeoisie. So now the spread of these ideas to the educated elite of European society was also important to the Enlightenment, right? The growth of both publishing and the growth of reading in public were important developments in the 18th century. Books had previously been aimed at small groups of the educated elite. Now books were written for a new reading public of the middle class. So the elite tended to be the monarch, right? Not the middle class people that may have a business, may have a little wealth. But now they were targeting them because they needed these ideas to spread. And the best way to make them spread was to get them outside of the circle. So now, this new reading public included women and artisans, people who practice a craft or trade in the city. Fielding's best known work is The History of Tom Jones, a Foundling, which describes the adventures of a young scoundrel. Magazines and newspapers were developed for the general public. Now, the first daily newspaper was printed in London in 1702. Newspapers were usually cheap, right? And some were available in free coffee houses. Coffee houses were also a place where there was an exchange of thoughts, which was really good during this time period because that helped spread these ideas during Enlightenment. Now, Enlightenment ideas were also spread through a saloon. Now, when we think about a saloon, it's not like a saloon that you hear about where people drink, right? Alcohol. Saloons were the elegant drawing rooms or rooms for entertaining guests. So imagine being in a home, right? And you have a living room, and then you have a family room. The living room is where all of your guests go, right? The ones that you want to impress, because you have all the fancy furniture, all the fancy tables, and all that there, right? You're not going to take them to the family room where you're going to have the old dumpy couch and the TV and all that, right? You're going to take them to the elegant place to entertain them and wow them. It's similar to a saloon, right? And in these great houses, it was for wealthy people of the city, because a lot of times there were really expensive drink, right? Really aristocratic, sophisticated individuals in these saloons. Now, the conversations were often about the new ideas of the philosophies. Now, women ran many of the saloons, which was very interesting. They were in the position to influence political opinion and help spread the ideas of enlightenment. Now, that takes us back to women's rights, right? Because Wollstonecraft was also talking about how men viewed women as not being logical. But these women owned these saloons and were actually helping to pass on Enlightenment ideas. So once again, that contradicted the mindset of a lot of men during this time period that women didn't have a say in the Enlightenment and the ideas and the spread of them. So now, let's talk about religion and the Enlightenment. So many philosophies attacked the Christian church, right? However, most Europeans in the 18th century were still Christians. Interesting, right? So people also look for a deeper personal devotion to God. The desire of ordinary Protestants for greater depths of religious experience led to new religious movements. So they were trying to have a relationship with God on a deeper level, right? Because they may have felt during this time that their relationship was very superficial. And in order for them to expand and get closer to God, they need to deepen that connection, right? So let's move on to Enlightenment and the arts. Now, architecture and the arts. So really, the Enlightenment also influenced some of the buildings that were built and some of the art that was painted or sculpted. So the Palace of Louis XIV at Versailles in France had influenced other European rulers to build grand residences, right? One of the greatest architects of the 18th century was Balthasar Neumann. Neumann's two masterpieces are of the Church of the 14 Saints in southern Germany and the residence, the Palace of the Prince Bishop of Wurzburg. And by the 1730s, a new artist style known as Rococo, was spread all over Europe. The Baroque style had been about greatness and power. The Rococo style was more about grace, style, and gentle action, right? So the Baroque style was about power, it was about dominance, it was about greatness, and then you have the Rococo, which was a little bit more subtle and soft and graceful. And you'll see that in some of the art when we do our gallery walk. Now, the lightness and charm of this style suggested the search for pleasure, happiness, and love. So they're moving away from this whole idea of dominance to a more simple and sensual look at life and art. So the appeal of the Rococo style is seen in the work of Antoine Watteau. In his paintings, gentlemen and ladies in elegant dresses reveal a world of upper-class pleasure and joy. One of Watteau's masterpieces, the Embarcaton of Cythera, shows French Rococo at its peak. And you'll get to see that picture as well as some other Rococo paintings, and you'll get to see the difference between those and the Baroque style. Now, we can't talk about art and architecture without talking about music. Music is also a huge influence when we talk about change and sparking new ideas. So the 18th century Europe produced some of the world's most lasting music. Two geniuses of the second half of the 18th century was Franz Joseph Haydn and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. And Miss Young loves Mozart. Haydn is great too, but Mozart, fire. Especially his operas are amazing, right? They were innovators who wrote musical called classical rather than the Baroque of Bach and Handel. Okay, Haydn spent most of his adult life as a musical director for wealthy Hungarian princesses. He visited England, where he experienced a world in which musicians wrote concerts for the public rather for aristocratic patrons or customers, right? This liberty, he called it, led him to write two great works, The Creation and The Seasons. Both of these works express universal themes of beginnings and everyday life. Now we have Mozart, and Mozart was a child prodigy. Now, the thing about him, even though he was a child prodigy and he did these amazing things, and he wrote his first opera at 12, his failure to get a regular patron, right? That means someone that was going to buy his music and support his artistry, right, led to a miserable life. And we are going to watch parts of Amadeus, which is a film about Mozart, and you will see in these different movie clips that because he was unable to get someone to pretty much buy into his art, he suffered a lot. He was poor and he died penniless and was actually buried in a pauper's grave. Now his works, The Marriage of Figaro, The Magic Flute, and Don Giovanni, are three of the world's greatest operas. Haydn told Mozart's father that his son was the greatest composer that he had ever known. So that is our lecture for lesson number 2. Once again, you can watch this video as many times as you need to in order to answer those 3 questions. But if you were paying attention and were following along, you should have been able to answer these questions with no issue. Once again, thank you for watching this lecture. Have a wonderful rest of your holiday, and I'll see you on Wednesday.